All right, so this unit is about game theory. And before we jump right into the note packet, I wanted to talk a little bit about what game theory is and just a couple of pieces of information for you. So first off, just to let you know, this unit I based heavily around a book and a YouTube series called Game Theory 101. The author who did both of those is named William Spaniel. I think he actually made the YouTube videos first, and then after that, he turned it into a book. So you're going to notice that as we go through this note packet that there's going to be different spots where we'll tell you like this will correspond to video, whatever. So that's just kind of an extra resource for you. If there's something that you want to have explained to you again in a different way by a different person, he walks through and really like breaks it down. His videos are great because he really goes through like piece by piece and highlights different parts of the matrices that we're going to be looking at. So just as a side note for you, that's a really good resource if that's something that's helpful for you. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about game theory. So what is game theory? If you don't know anything about game theory, then you probably, like me, sort of figure that game theory is about like, how do you win at checkers? Or like, what's the best strategy for tic-tac-toe? And you're right that that is part of what game theory is. But game theory is actually a lot bigger than that. So when we talk about a game in game theory, we don't necessarily mean like a board game or like a competitive kind of game that you're playing. So a game in game theory is anything where you need to make decisions, okay? And that's what game theory is all about. It's all about making decisions. So we're going to talk a lot about all different areas that you're going to see game theory in. It can come when you have two different competing businesses and they have to decide what they're going to price their product at, right? That's a game, if you will, because they have an opponent that they want to do better than, right? They want to win the game in this competition. So it's about trying to predict what your opponent is going to do and then from that make a decision. We're going to look at a bunch of real life examples. There's an awesome example from the game Survivor, so the TV show Survivor, where they outwit, outplay, outlast. There's an awesome example of game theory in that, where somebody made a really good decision that actually led to them winning $1 million. We're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the Cuban Missile Crisis was all just a game theory piece. Okay, so that's the idea when we talk about game theory. It's about having a set of rules and an opponent, if you will, that you are competing against and you want to do the best outcome possible for yourself given the situation. Okay, so that's sort of what we're going to look at. So we're going to start by talking about something called a Nash equilibrium. So a Nash equilibrium, if there's just one, it's an equilibrium. If there's more than one, it's equilibria. Okay, so equilibrium, singular, equilibria, plural. So that's going to be where we kind of jump in. We're going to talk about payoff matrices and we're going to talk about choosing strategies. So let's hop in with our notes. All right, so as promised, you've got your little note telling you what video this corresponds to. I'm going to link that playlist in the description for this, or you can find it just by Googling Game Theory 101. It'll pop right up. So a Nash equilibrium, what is that? So the Nash part, that is a guy's name. So there was a very famous man. Have you ever seen the movie A Brilliant Mind? It's about a man whose last name was Nash, and he did a lot of stuff with game theory. So he came up with this thing called a Nash equilibrium. We're going to talk a little bit more about his contribution later and why it's actually named after him. But he basically came up with this thing where he said that whenever you have any kind of a game, there is a particular strategy where there is, it's in neither player's best interest to switch what they're doing. Okay, and what Nash actually did was he proved that in any finite game, so any game that ends, that there's at least one of those. Excuse me. Okay. There can be multiple Nash equilibria in any given game, so that is a thing that can happen. Okay, we're going to take a look at an example, and that's going to make it much more clear what we're talking about with this Nash equilibrium thing. Okay, so this is a really famous game theory example called the prisoner's dilemma. So basically, you have two people who have both been arrested. The police suspect that they were trying to commit a robbery, but they don't have enough evidence to actually convict both of them. So they have the evidence to convict them of trespassing because they know they were somewhere they shouldn't be, but they don't actually have the evidence to show that they were going to steal something. So the prisoners who are in separate rooms are each offered a deal. If neither one of them confesses, then the cops can't do anything. All they're going to do is they're going to charge them with trespassing, and the guys are going to spend just 1 month in jail. Okay. However, the deal is that if one of them confesses and the other one doesn't, whoever confessed gets to go free without any jail time, and the other person gets a year in jail. Okay, so if just one of them confesses, then they get to walk free, and the other person will end up spending much longer in jail. Okay, however, if they both confess, then they're going to end up with 8 months of jail time each. Okay, so that's kind of this balance here. So it's a decision where you have to decide, like, okay, well, am I going to keep quiet? Am I going to try to confess? What's going to happen in the outcome here? So we're going to talk about how you make that decision, and we're going to take a look at this little payoff matrix right here. So this is called a payoff matrix. All right, this is something we're going to see a lot of in this unit, and I want to talk about, first of all, how it breaks down. So first of all, you've got 2 different prisoners that are represented here. These are the 2 players in your game. So prisoner 1 is kind of the horizontal component, and prisoner 2 is kind of the vertical component. Okay, so when we take a look at this, what's sort of happening, I'm going to color code to sort of help you out. So prisoner 1, and by default, we use masculine pronouns when we talk about prisoner 1, and feminine pronouns when we talk about prisoner 2. That's just a default in game theory, just because it can make it a lot easier when you're talking about something to just be able to say he or she and have the other person know what you're saying rather than player 1, player 2 all the time. So that's just sort of a default. Okay, so these numbers here represent the outcomes for each individual person. Okay, so this first one here, if prisoner 1 stays quiet and prisoner 2 also stays quiet, this first number represents what the outcome will be for player 1. Okay, so if they both keep quiet, prisoner 1 is going to get 1 month in jail, right? That's what the deal was. Okay, if player 1, prisoner 1, keeps quiet and prisoner 2 confesses, well, that means that prisoner 1 is going to end up spending 12 months in jail. So it's a negative 12 because you're losing, right? You're losing out. It's a bad thing. So we have a negative outcome here. So it's a negative 12 months in jail. If prisoner 1 confesses and prisoner 2 keeps quiet, that means that prisoner 1 gets to go free, right? And his buddy is going to end up in jail for a year. All right, and then the last one is that if prisoner 1 confesses and prisoner 2 also confesses, then prisoner 1 is going to get 8 months of jail. Okay, so those first numbers represent the outcomes for prisoner 1. Okay, the other way gives you the outcomes for prisoner 2. So prisoner 2, their 2 choices are they can either keep quiet or they can confess. Okay, if prisoner 2 keeps quiet when prisoner 1 is also keeping quiet, then the outcome is that prisoner 2 will spend a month in jail. Okay, if prisoner 2 confesses and prisoner 1 keeps quiet, okay, then that means that he's going to get or she's going to get off free and he is going to end up going to jail, right? So her outcome would be no jail time. If prisoner 2 keeps quiet and prisoner 1 confesses, that's the bad circumstance, right? Because he gets to go free, but she is going to end up spending a year in jail. Okay, and if they both confess, then she's going to end up spending 8 months in jail. Okay, so as you kind of look at these, you got to make sure you know which number goes with which player. Okay, you can think of it as these are the horizontal ones and these are the vertical ones. So just like how points are X and Y, horizontal component, vertical component, same thing. Or you can just sort of remember that that's how they work out. Okay, so that's how you read a payoff matrix. So basically the idea is that we just want to summarize all of this information numerically in this lovely little table. Okay, so that's kind of what the point of this part is. So now that we have this summary, we want to be able to look at this and figure out what is our Nash equilibrium, okay? And a reminder is the Nash equilibrium is any strategy where it's in neither player's best interest to switch their choice. Okay, so let's take a look at what these outcomes are. So let's start with this first one. All we're going to do for right now is we're going to look at each one of these and decide if it is a Nash equilibrium. Later, we're going to talk about how do you find a Nash equilibrium. Okay, so let's take a look. So this first one, -1, -1, okay? So if they both keep quiet, they both end up spending a month in jail. So the question here, if this is a Nash equilibrium, then neither player benefits by changing their decision, okay? Well, let's take a look. If prisoner 2 changes their decision and instead of keeping quiet, chooses to confess, that means that instead of having a -1 outcome, they'd only have a 0 outcome, right? Which is better for them. So if prisoner 2 knows that prisoner 1 is going to keep quiet, then there's no reason why prisoner 2 would also want to keep quiet, right? So that is not a Nash equilibrium. because player 2, if they knew what player 1 was going to do, could change their decision and come out with a better outcome. Okay. Similarly, if we looked at this the other way, if we looked at it from player 1's perspective, right? Player 1's perspective, if they know that prisoner 2 is going to keep quiet, right? Then they'd be better off confessing because that's going to improve their outcome. Instead of having 1 month of jail time, they'll have no jail time. Okay, so this one is not a Nash equilibrium, right? I know it's not a Nash equilibrium because both players can improve their situation by changing their choice. Okay, so let's look at this one. Confessing and keeping quiet. Keeping quiet and confessing. That's the order you always do it in. Player 1, then player 2. All right, so is this a Nash equilibrium? Well, again, going a piece at a time. If player 1 is definitely keeping quiet and player 2 has to decide whether they're going to keep quiet or confess, right? If player 2 changes their choice, that's worse for them, right? So that's not something that they'd want to switch. So right now, we're halfway there. Right? A Nash equilibrium is where neither player would want to switch their decision. And right now, player 2 would not want to switch. All right, what about player 1, right? If we knew that player 2 was going to confess, would player 1 also be better off confessing? Well, yeah, right? He'd be seeing jail time either way. But a year versus 8 months of jail time, the 8 months would be better. So this one is not a Nash equilibrium, right? It's halfway is because player 2, right? They would want to stay with their decision. But since player 1 would be better off switching, it's not a Nash equilibrium. It has to be true for both. Okay, this one. Player 1 confesses, player 2 keeps quiet, right? So if player 2 definitely knows that player 1 is going to confess, are they better off switching? Yeah, right? Still be getting jail time, but they'd be getting less jail time, right? So without even checking player 1, I know this is not a Nash equilibrium because it has to be true for both. But if I did want to check player 1, would player 1 want to switch? No, they wouldn't, right? Because switching their decision would mean that you would end up with jail time when you don't have any right now. All right, what about this last one? So they both confess, right? Well, if player 1 confesses, if we know that player 1 is definitely going to confess, is player 2 better off switching their decision? No, because that's going to result in increased jail time. Okay. Well, what about if we definitely keep player 2 confessing, right? Would player 1 be better off switching to being quiet? Again, no, because that would result in more jail time for him, right? So this cell right here is our Nash equilibrium, okay? It is a decision where in this situation, neither player would want to change their decision if they ended up if they ended up being in a situation where that was happening, they wouldn't have wanted to make a different decision, okay? Or another way to think about it is that if this, decision came down, right, where say it was this first one here, right, or this guy here, right, where player 1 was quiet and player 2 confessed. If that's what actually happened, player 2 would be kicking themselves, right, because they'd be like, man, if I had only confessed 2, I would have ended up with less jail time, right? Or if it had been this guy right here, right, where they both kept quiet, they would have said, man, if I had only confessed, I would have gotten away with no jail time, right? So at the end, they would both be saying man, if I'd only done this differently, then I would have been better off. Whereas in this situation, neither player is going to say that, right? Because player 1, if he says, oh man, if I had only kept quiet, no, that would have been worse, right? And player 2, if they said, man, if only I had kept quiet, that would also be worse. So this is the only situation where neither player is going to regret their decision and wish that they'd done the other thing because it would have worked out better for them. And that's what a Nash equilibrium is. It's like a no regrets decision where if that's what it comes down to, it's like, well, I did the best that I could and that's all it is. Okay, so our Nash equilibrium would be confess, confess. All right, this is a notation you'd use, all right, where the first confess is talking about what player's 1 decisions is, and the second one is talking about what player 2's decision was. Okay, now the thing about Nash equilibrium, right, is that it's a no regrets decision, but it's not actually the best outcome, right? The best outcome on this board would be if they both kept quiet, right? That works out best for both of them. So just because you can look at this and logically you can look at it and you can say, well, you should both keep quiet, right? If your partner, right, which this is a criminal, right? You're talking about 2 criminals here, not the most trustworthy of characters. So it's the kind of thing that, like, yeah, being quiet, both of you would have been the best outcome, right? But you can't necessarily trust your opponent, your partner in this case, right? To make the decision that's going to be best for you, right? If player two knows that player one's going to be quiet, then they're better off confessing so that they get less jail time, right? If it's just each player's looking out only for themselves situation, then you want to kind of go based off of what the best outcome for you is. All right, so it can seem kind of counterintuitive that the Nash equilibrium is not necessarily the same as what would be like the outcome you think would be best for both people objectively. It's just one where you have no regrets at the end. Okay, so that's the idea of what a Nash equilibrium is, and that's what we're going to be hunting for the first part of this unit, is how do we look at a payoff matrix and figure out what our Nash equilibrium is without having to actually check each one like we just did. Okay, so let's talk about strict dominance, okay? So a strict dominance, a strategy is considered strictly dominant if it always gives a higher payoff than all other strategies, regardless of what other players do. Okay, so it's a strategy where no matter what, that is your best bet. Doesn't matter what the other person does, right? It's still your best bet always, okay? If you use a strict dominance strategy, it's a particular type of Nash equilibrium. So there's there's all these different Nash equilibriums, and then within that, there's a smaller group where you have a strict dominance, okay? So it is a type of Nash equilibrium, but it's not the only type. Okay, so this is a strategy that you can use to find a Nash equilibria. Sometimes it won't always work because there's not always a strictly dominant strategy. Okay, great. Let's look at an example. This will make a lot more sense. So many countries place tariffs or taxes on imported goods to protect domestic industries. A country can choose whether to levy a tax against other countries. What is the Nash equilibrium of this game? Okay, so basically, right, the idea here is that when we talk about importing goods to protect your domestic industries, so ideally most countries, like, it is cheaper and better for you if you make everything in your country and sell it in your country, right? Because then you don't have to worry about like shipping costs and things like that. So for the most part, that's kind of like the best outcome, but realistically, many countries can't make everything that they need for their own country, right? So that's where they have to be able to import things. And then they're usually going to be creating an abundance of a particular product that is more than their country actually needs. And then they're going to want to export that. Okay, so basically how this kind of works out is that you can choose whether or not you are going to tax people who bring their goods to your countries. Okay, so if somebody wants to sell something in my country, I say, hey, thanks, glad you're selling that here. I'm going to charge you tax to do it. Okay, it's a very common thing, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to do that. So that's kind of what this Nash equilibrium, or I'm sorry, what this payoff matrix is representing. So we have two different countries. So player one is a country, player two is another country. Okay, and they can choose whether they're going to levy a tax against the other country or not. Okay, or, sorry, no tax versus tax. Okay, so these are our different possible things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to color code this, which is a really great way to get started with these. As you're starting to learn payoff matrices, it just kind of helps keep things straight, right? So remember, the first number is always the outcome for player one, and then the second number is the outcome for player two. Okay, so looking at this, right? Question is, where do these numbers come from, right? There's no numbers in this problem. Where does these numbers come from? So the numbers are basically assigned sort of arbitrarily. It's not like a realistic number, like how in this one it was talking about jail time in a particular number of months. Okay, this is just more about like things that are good for you versus things that are bad for you. So like if we look at the green numbers here, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So as you kind of look at these, by default, lower numbers are worse than higher numbers, okay? So basically what this is saying is that of these options, this would be the best option for country one, this would be the second best option, this would be third, and that would be fourth, okay? And they get different numbers to kind of give you an idea of like, yeah, 2 is better than 1, but since 4 is a much higher number, right? The difference between 4 and 1, like you'd much rather have 4 than you would 1. Okay, so it's a way of like ranking your choices to say like, okay, if I can't have this thing, then I'd rather have this thing. It's not as good, but it's still okay. All right, so that's kind of what this is. Like if this is the best choice that we have, that's the second best, that's the third best, that's the worst. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. So we're looking for a strictly dominant strategy. Okay, that is a decision that one country can make that no matter what is the better option for them. So let's start with player one's options. So if player one chooses not to tax the other country, right, their outcomes are going to be 3 and 1, okay, depending on what player two does. Okay, if instead player one chooses to tax their country, their outcomes are going to be 4 and 2, depending on what player one does. Right? So that tells me that taxing is a strictly dominant strategy. Why? Right? Because if this were the option, right, from this cell right here, if we knew that player one was not going to apply a tax, then you definitely wouldn't want to not apply a tax yourself, right? You'd be better off doing a tax. So this would be the better option if player two is definitely not applying a tax. If player two is applying a tax, you would still be better off applying a tax yourself, right? Because switching to no tax would make it so that you get a less of an outcome, right? So the 4 and the 2 are both better options than the 3 and the 1. Okay, so that is what makes this a strictly dominant strategy. No matter what, player one is going to want to choose to levy a tax. Okay, so it's a strictly dominated strategy. So we've got player one, this is definitely going to be their choice. What about player two? Okay, well, player two, so if we look at player two's options, these are the pink numbers, right? If they choose not to levy a tax, their outcomes are going to be 3 and 4. If they choose to tax, their outcomes are 1 and 2, right? So if they choose not to do a tax, no matter what, they're better off not, right? They're better off picking this, oops, I'm sorry, I highlighted the wrong numbers. I apologize. These guys. Okay, so if player one chooses not to do a tax, then they're definitely better off choosing to tax, right? Because this is the higher outcome for them. If player two does choose to do a tax, still player two is better off choosing to also apply a tax because those numbers are better, right? So the 4 and the 2 are higher than the 3 and the 1. So taxing is the strictly dominant strategy for this country as well. Okay, and since both of these are strictly dominant strategies, that means that the Nash equilibria for this particular problem is this guy right here. They're going to both want to tax the other country. Okay, so my Nash equilibria would be tax, tax. All right, and we can check that because is this a Nash equilibrium? Well, if this was the decision that was made, would player two be better off changing their decision? If player two changed their decision, that would put us in the cell over here. No, that's worse for them, right? If player one changed their decision, would that be better or worse for them? Well, if player one changes their decision, that's worse for them as well, right? So neither one of them is going to want to change their decision. That's a Nash equilibrium. Okay, so they both had a strictly dominant strategy, and that's what we wanted to use. All right, let's look at this next one. So advertising. So companies who advertise their products generally see an increase in sales over companies who don't advertise a similar product. This was something that I kind of found with the movie Solo, the Star Wars movie Solo. They really didn't advertise that movie very much, and it ended up not making a lot of revenue in the box office, partly because it wasn't the best Star Wars movie ever, but partly because they just didn't advertise much of it, so they didn't get as many people going to the theaters to see it. Okay, so advertising is generally better, right? But it does have some downsides because it's costly, right? You have to, if you choose to advertise, you have to pay money to do that. Okay, and if both companies are advertising, they kind of cancel out each other's efforts. It's sort of like toothpaste commercials. Like if you only ever see toothpaste commercials for Colgate, right, then you're only ever going to think of Colgate. But if Colgate and Crest are doing them, then you probably can't really like keep them apart in your head. It's like, oh yeah, that toothpaste commercial. It was one of those companies, right? So they sort of cancel each other's effort out. Okay, so we want to look at what our Nash equilibrium for this game is. All right, so again, I'm just going to start by highlighting, right, the different outcomes for each player. So those are player one's outcomes, and here's player two's outcomes. I really find the color coding helps a lot. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So what are our possible outcomes? So we've got, again, these 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can sort of see here why these different outcomes, or what these different outcomes are, where they make sense. Okay, so let's just chat through this problem a little bit. So if company 1 doesn't do any ads and company 2 also doesn't do any ads, right, then that's like a 3 out of these 4 options. Why? Well, because you're not getting as much revenue, right? You're not getting the extra revenue from advertising, but also you didn't actually pay any money to advertise. So like you're kind of like, oh, okay, like this isn't bad. Like we're not getting the extra, but at least we didn't lose money on the deal, right? So that's kind of why that would be a 3. This one where you're running ads and the company's not running ads, that's kind of the best outcome because you're going to get a lot more business than the company that didn't advertise at all. People are going to recognize your brand and want your product when they won't recognize the other person's brand. Okay, this one where you don't run any ads, but the other company does, okay, that is your worst outcome. Why? Because you're not advertising your product and they are advertising their product. So people are going to recognize their brand and buy their product, not yours. Okay, and then this last one, this outcome of 2, when you're both running ads, right? Well, neither one of you is particularly getting a boost, right? Because you're kind of canceling each other out, but you also had to put all that money into running the ads, so that's not great. Okay, so those are kind of like the 4 possible outcomes. Not running ads when the other company runs ads is the worst, right? Because you don't get the business. If you both run ads, that's second worst because you've spent money but not really seen much to show for it. You not running ads and them not running ads is slightly better than that because at least you didn't waste the money, right? And then if you run ads and they don't, that's the best because you're going to get the most customers. Okay, so that's kind of how these numbers are broken down. You just sort of assign numbers based on what your personal preferences are. And these would be numbers that the companies themselves would have to decide on what the order is, what ones are the most important, and how much more important are they. Okay, so let's look for our strictly dominant strategy. So again, I'm going to kind of go through this and I want to try to see, all right, what are the dominant strategies? We'll start with the green player, player 1. Okay, so player 1 has to choose, are they going to do no ads or are they going to do ads? So let's compare our outcomes. If they choose no ads, they're either going to get 3 or 1 as their outcome, depending on what player 2 does. If they choose to run ads, they're either going to get 4 or 2, depending on what player 2 does. So no matter what, they're better off running ads, right? Because it's going to give you a higher outcome than not running ads. So the strictly dominant strategy for player 1 would be running the ads. All right, what about player 2? Well, player 2, right, if they choose to run the ads, or sorry, not run the ads, then their outcomes are going to be 3 or 1. If they do run the ads, their outcomes are going to be 4 or 2, right? And once again, they're always better off running ads, right? Because if they run ads here, they're going to get 4 versus 3. If they run ads here, they're going to get 2 versus 1. So again, they would be better off running ads, and our Nash equilibrium is down here, and it's going to be that both company run ads. If you happen to notice, this is actually the exact same table as that one, just happened to work out that way. Okay, so these are our Nash equilibria. So let's take a look at this next one. So the 2012 Summer Olympics. So this one has a little bit of a story to it. So here's the story of what happened with the 2012 Summer Olympics. So it's about badminton, right, which is a sport that you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. But the tournament that they had basically had 2 different sort of rounds to it. The first part, they did a round robin group play where basically every team played every other team, right? And then after that part of it was done, they went to single elimination quarterfinals, which is how kind of what you're familiar with sports. You lose and you're out, okay? So from there, like the decision of how you play in the quarterfinals depends on how you do in the round robin. So people who played the best and second best would end up playing each other in the elimination game, right? So, and the worst teams would end up playing each other in the elimination games, right? So in the 2012 Olympics, a weird thing happened. The final day of the round robin part of it, the team that was considered to be the second best in the world actually lost. Okay, I'm not sure why they lost, but something went wrong and they lost, right? So their previous wins, because they had won every other round, right, that was enough to get them to like into the quarterfinals where they're doing the elimination round. But it ran into this weird problem where now the other teams who were playing against them didn't actually want to be the best, right? Because if you were like a higher up winning like your team won more, then you'd be more likely to play the second best team in the world and get knocked out right away, right? So it actually ended up with this weird thing where the people who were competing actually wanted to lose their matches instead of winning them, because in doing so, like, you'd be better off losing, because if you win, you're more likely to play that one really tough team who accidentally lost. Okay, so we're kind of look at what this outcome is. So trying and failing here is kind of what your idea is. Okay, so trying meaning try to win the game, and failing meaning try to fail winning the game, so losing basically, right? Okay, so normally trying would be a good thing and failing would be a bad thing, right? That's usually how sports work. Okay, but in this particular instance, that's not the case, right? So as you kind of look at these outcomes, so let's look at a particular team. So this team, team one. Okay, so team one, their possible outcomes. Well, if they try to win and the other team tries to win, it is what it is. Whichever one is the better team will win, and it's just sort of a null outcome. Their efforts sort of cancel each other out, right? If they try to fail and the other team tries to win, that's their best outcome, right? Because they want to fail. They want to lose this game. So if one team is trying to win the game and the other team's trying to fail, then they're happy, right? That's their best outcome, a positive one outcome, because they're going to get the thing that they want, which is to lose, which is weird. Okay. Up here, if they try to win and the other team tries to fail, that's their worst outcome, right? If they try and the other team doesn't, then they're definitely going to win, which is the worst case scenario here. And if both teams try to fail, again, that's sort of a wash, because you're just going to be increasingly trying to out-lose to the other person. So the two kind of similar things here are, if you both try or if you both fail, then you both sort of like cancel each other out. Okay, so let's take a look for what our Nash equilibrium is. So for player one, right, what's their best option here? So they need to decide whether they're going to try or they're going to try not to try. I'm sorry, they're going to deliberately fail. Sorry, it gets a little bit confusing. Okay, so what are the possible outcomes here? So if player one knows that player two is going to try, then what should they do? Well, they should try to fail, right? This would be their better option. If player one knows that player two is going to deliberately try to fail, then again, the better option for player one is this bottom one, failing, right? So this is going to be the strictly dominant strategy. No matter what this player does, right? Player two is better off with this because these numbers are higher than those numbers, and that's the better outcome. All right, what about player two? Player two, when we look at this guy, right? Well, when I compare these, if player two is going to try, right? Or I'm sorry, if player two knows that player one is going to try, which one's their better outcome? Well, they should choose this one, right? That's the higher number. If player two knows that player one is going to fail, right, then they should choose this one because it's a higher number. So either way, they're better off choosing to fail because that's going to get them the higher number. Okay, so notice that when you're comparing, right, the green numbers we're kind of comparing top to bottom, and the pink numbers we're sort of comparing left to right. So once again, this bottom corner cell, fail, fail, becomes our Nash equilibrium. It's not always the bottom corner. It just seems to happen that way for these first few examples. Okay. All right. So next one we have here, this one is about an arms race. So we've got different countries and they are deciding whether or not they want to develop new military technology. Okay, so thinking about this, right, we want to decide, okay, do we try to develop like better weapons or do we not try to develop better weapons? What's the best outcome? So passing means you decide not to, building means that, yeah, you're going to try to build better weapons. So again, I'm going to color code this a little bit. Here's my outcomes for player one. All right, and here's my outcomes for player two. So thinking about this logically, where are these numbers coming from? We got this 1, 2, or 0 for green, right? 0, -1, -1, -2, right? Why is this one 0, right? Well, this is the highest option, which would be where you would both choose not to make weapons, right? The next highest option would be either of these two, where either you choose not to build them and the other country does choose to build them, because in that case, like, okay, yeah, you don't have any weapons and the other country does, but that country is not really going to see you as a threat, right? So they're not necessarily going to feel the need to attack you. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, we got weapons, we could take you out anytime we want to, but no need to actually do it because we know that we're safe. Okay. Similarly here, if you choose to build weapons and the other country chooses to pass from doing that, it's like, okay, well, that's not quite as good as if you both pass and we're just going to have peace, right? Because you did have to put all that money into the research and the development. So you are kind of losing out a little bit, but at least you're not under threat, right? So, okay, that's a little bit better. And then for this one right here, if you both choose to build weapons, right, then that's kind of the worst option for you. Because then you're both building weapons, you have all these weapons, and the chances that something's going to go wrong and there's going to be a war kind of increase. Okay, so having kind of established where these numbers come from, right, which again would be kind of a personal choice based on the country and what their outcomes are, let's take a look at what our Nash equilibrium would be. So again, I'm looking for dominant strategies. So for player 1, right, if they know player 2 is going to pass, right, what's the better outcome for them? Well, then they'd also be better off passing. Okay, if player 1 knows that player 2 is going to build, what's the better outcome? They'd be better off passing, right? Still a negative number, but it's at least less negative. So no matter what, player 1's going to be better off choosing not to build. Okay, player 2, right, if they know that player 1 is going to pass, then what should player 2 choose to do? Well, this would be the better option. Building would be better for them, right? Okay, so they'd want to choose to build. If they know that player 1 is going to build, then again, building's the better option for them, right? That's the higher number. So they're going to want to choose to build. So in this case, our Nash equilibrium is pass and build. Okay, not the ideal circumstance. Not everybody's going to be happy, but that's the happiest that they can be. This is the one choice where neither player is going to go, oh man, I should have done this instead. All right, and that's what we consider to be a Nash equilibrium. Okay, so we're going to keep looking at what a Nash equilibrium is as we go on in this unit. We're going to keep looking at these payoff matrices and kind of where they're valuable, and look at some more like kind of real life processes that people would go through for game theory as we move on.